It is the most thankless job in all of auto racing. They are in every type of motorsport from the highest division to the lowest. You see them at your local short track, you see them in Formula 1. They're derogatorily called back markers, rolling chicanes, jobbers, no-hopers, start-and parkers, and most commonly, and perhaps most fittingly, field fillers. Promoters love them, the biggest stars in racing find them annoying, and fans are more or less split on them. But let's take some time to give these guys and girls their day in the sun, because without them, racing wouldn't be nearly as interesting as it is. You play to win the game, and you race to win. But some drivers show up to a track not hoping to win, but just to have some fun or make a little bit of money. Last place still pays, and promoters love boasting about big fields of cars. Because what's better than cars going fast? Easy, lots of cars going fast. And to an extent, drivers like big fields too. If you win a race but there are only 5 competitors, it doesn't seem that impressive. But when you win a race and there's 40 competitors, now that's impressive. And when a track promoter advertises a 30-car field and then 35 cars show up and 5 teams have to go home, that even makes qualifying gripping entertainment. What was just procedural is now a race in and of itself. Race teams spend hundreds of man-hours per week just to get their cars ready, and all of that just goes in the dumpster if you can't make the show. This is high-tension entertainment at its finest. But having more cars show up for a race than you advertised is rare, especially these days. Often a promoter has trouble even getting the base number of cars to roll off the grid. So how do you pad out those numbers? In comes our hero of the day, the field filler. You can have the best drivers in the country competing at your track, but if there's only a handful of them, it gets pretty boring pretty quick. And as the late great Bill France Sr. once said, the leader has to do some passing of his own, right? Watching the fastest guy on track navigate his way around the slowest guy from time to time is far more interesting than just watching him ride off into the sunset. And this is not a new phenomenon. The field filler goes back to the very first auto race in America back in 1895, the Chicago to Evanston race, a 54-mile endurance race. Yeah, 50-something miles constituted an endurance race back then. Hey, it was the 19th century, these things had only just been invented, cut them some slack. Originally, 80 drivers had promised to show up, but the race was in November, and in the freezing snow, only 11 said they would show up come race day. Well, race day came around and only 6 cars showed up. Imagine getting hyped up about this by the paper that agreed to sponsor the race, the Chicago Times-Herald, only for the field to be 1/13 of the expected size. Of those 6 that rolled off the grid, 2 of them were motorcycles. That's right, 4-wheeled cars and motorcycles competed against each other back in the day. It's not really clear whether or not the motorcyclists knew what they were getting into, but neither of them finished the race because there was a hill on the course that was so steep they couldn't climb it. They had to have known about the course layout ahead of time, and they had to have known they couldn't have climbed that hill. But they showed up anyway just to fill out the field and make the race seem a little bit more respectable. These 2 guys did get some payment for their time, but freezing your ass off in Chicago in the snow couldn't have possibly been worth it. But evidently, some guys and girls did think it was worth it, because these jobbers kept showing up to races. For them, racing wasn't about the glory, it was just about the pure fun of it, the thrill of being a common person doing uncommon things. These people were as pure of a racer as you could ask for. And although they were in it for fun mostly, they were still in it for the cash. That paycheck helped them put food on the table, and old beat-up cars were so cheap in the post-World War II years that you could totally race, finish in the back half of the field, and still make a profit. Even in the very first NASCAR race ever, the modified race at the Daytona Beach Circuit in 1948, there were still a bunch of field fillers. More than 70 drivers showed up, knowing full well that most of them would never even complete the full distance. They just wanted to be a part of something amazing, etch their names into the history books, and make a little cheddar while they were doing it. The first Cup race held in July of 1949 had 33 starters, and most of them you've never heard of. Slick Smith, Pee Wee Martin, George Mantooth, Felix Wilkes, Skimp Hersey. You might not have known them, but these guys mattered. Some of them only made a few starts and would probably scoff if you called their antics a racing career. But they took on the thankless task of filling out the field, made their money, and went on about their lives like all the rest of us. But field filling had not yet reached its peak. Far from it. Finishing dead last kept paying better and better, and eventually the art of the start and park would begin. The idea was you would roll onto the track with no intention of even racing. A driver would pick a race with a thin field where he was basically guaranteed to start, take the green flag, run a few laps, take his car to the garage claiming he had some sort of mechanical issue, and then pack it up, go to the payout booth, and call it a day. In the early days, these guys were pretty easy to spot on the scoring sheet. Their reason for retiring from the race was either not given or, quote, handling. Seems like an excuse to me, but track promoters kept paying them because it made the fields look better. And they were making bank off this, so why not throw a few bucks at a guy helping you meet the advertised field number? Start and parking arguably became its most nefarious in 1964, when Curtis Kreider was traveling with Buddy Baker to the July race at Bridgehampton, New York. They swung by the home of Radis Walters, who owned the car Larry Frank had driven to victory in 1962 at the Southern 500. The car was actually in really good shape, and it had everything except the motor. Kreider bought the car at a fair price, hooked it up to his hauler, but when he got to the track, he noticed that the field was one car short of the advertised 25-car field. What happened next can only be described as one of the ballsiest acts ever pulled off in motorsports. Kreider got one of his crew members to wear his spare helmet and suit up for the race to drive the motorless car he had just bought. He told one of the track workers that the car just needed a little extra push to get it fired up. The crewman ran the pace lap being pushed by the tow truck, and when the green flag fell, the crewman simply dipped into the pits and was instructed by Crowder to act like he was upset. Kreider told him to throw your helmet in disgust, kick the tires, cry a little, make a scene of it. And it worked. Since the car finished last, it was never subjected to post-race tech inspection, and Kreider got a little extra money for his trip up to New York. He called it a riverboat gamble, and he came out of it smelling like a rose. He got paid, but to this day, NASCAR does not acknowledge the 25th starter, and records show that only 24 cars started the race. Start and park efforts as egregious as this one would end up being part of a bygone era in early NASCAR lore, and while honest field fillers kept showing up, it usually took an economic downturn to bring them back to prominence. The stagflation years of the 70s saw fields get pretty lean, and NASCAR introduced monetary incentives to pay out to independent teams who ran the whole schedule. Jimmy Means was a career racer who ran most of his career as an owner-driver, much like J.D. McDuffie, and the two of them never had any delusions of greatness, but this was something he loved to do and was able to make a living off of it. In the 90s, NASCAR was having trouble getting full fields to show up. Economic stagnation had dried up a lot of the sponsor money from the booming 80s, and in 1992, only 27 drivers completed the whole 29-race schedule. In 11 races, either no one failed to qualify or only one did. But Jimmy Means stepped up to pad out the field by running his backup car as an entrant. He ran the number 52, but he'd take a couple of extra number 2 decals, cut them in half, and mirror them over each other to make a 3. Sometimes he'd haul even a third car to the track and have some fellow independents run a few laps in them only to park them early and take home some prize money. Jimmy Means called these cars his grocery getters. Sometimes field fillers even had championship implications. In the 80s and 90s, it was common in the final race of the season for the driver with the best shot at winning the race to have his car owner enter a field filler to pull off the track after the race started, so the championship hopeful wouldn't have to get last place points and stood a slightly better chance at winning the cup. In a worst case scenario, if the championship hopeful's car wouldn't start, he would simply take control of the other car and start that one instead. In 1981, going into the final race of the season, Darrell Waltrip was going to be champion, provided that he started the race and did not finish last. J.D. McDuffie was actually hired by Junior Johnson to make sure that this happened, and drove an identical car to Darrell. But as the 90s dragged on, the economy bounced back in a big way. There were so many cars entering races now that even the big money regulars had difficulty making the field. Legacy organizations missed multiple races throughout the year, and at one point, Jeff Burton failed to make the field while he was second in the points. But to still encourage field fillers to show up, NASCAR introduced a bonus plan in the early 2000s that offered $8,000 just to show up and attempt a race, with an additional $15,000 as a performance bonus. By 2001, there were 45 teams that had declared to run the entire schedule. The field size was capped at 43 cars, so any part-time field filler hoping to run a race would have to oust 3 full-time competitors. This put a damper on independent and part-time racers, and by the time 2004 came around, only 36 full-time teams were around. And 9 teams that had attempted races in 2003 never attempted a start in 2004. The Morgan McClure number 4 and the Roush Racing number 99 had trouble getting sponsors, and were faced with shutting down. Things were looking kinda bad. So in 2005, NASCAR implemented a provisional system with extra cash payouts to encourage the field fillers to come back, and return they did in larger numbers than ever. Kirk Shelmerdine, Arnold Motorsports, Morgan Shepherd, Phoenix Racing, Andy Belmont, and many, many others took full advantage of the payouts, and this made field filling a steady form of income for these guys. But they were by no means rich. Yeah, they had expensive cars, but they often showed up to the track with a simple closed trailer pulled by a pickup truck, and often borrowed parts from one another and some of the bigger teams just looking to help out. And when they bought a car from another team, often they didn't even remove the previous paint job or wrap because they literally could not afford to do so. If you want to know more details on some of the antics that these field fillers got up to in the 2000s, definitely check out Brock Beard and his series Rise of the Field Fillers. It's a great watch. This led NASCAR to introduce the top 35 rule, where if you were in the top 35 in owner points, you were guaranteed a starting spot. NASCAR wagered that this would also encourage start-and parkers to run the whole race to nab extra points and stay in the top 35. But instead, start-and-park ventures grew in popularity. Getting last place points was still enough to keep you ahead of guys who never even got the chance to score points. Prize money was at all-time highs, and finishing dead last in the Daytona 500 paid over $250,000. This was also at a time when costs were skyrocketing and tires were more expensive than ever. It makes tons of financial sense to just never run the whole race. This, however, killed off a lot of mid-pack smaller teams. PPI Motorsports, just 3 years removed from their dramatic finish at Darlington, called it quits at the end of 2006, failing to keep inside of the top 35 for most of the year. Later in the 2010s, NASCAR would finally eliminate starting and parking and legislated that everybody had to attempt the entire race. From then on, if you came into the garage saying that you had just blown your motor had best be blown up. If it wasn't, well, you would be told not to show up for the next race. The dubiously titled Front Row Motorsports made up a good chunk of start and park slots in the 2000s. But with these rule changes, they eventually got enough money backing them that they morphed into a legitimate team, and thus far they've actually won some races too, and even won the Daytona 500 in 2021. But that then leads to the question, what happens when a field filler finds themselves in contention for the win? Well, as we all know, it's entirely possible to win a NASCAR race by complete accident, and we almost got exactly that at the Aaron's 312 at Talladega in 2002. After a few laps of competition, some field fillers had bowed out, but then the largest wreck in modern NASCAR history happened, with only 12 cars making it out unscathed. A lot of field fillers suddenly and miraculously fixed their cars and went back out there to get top 10 prize money. Andy Kirby and Jimmy Kitchens got their only career top 10s, finishing 6th and 7th respectively, and nabbed an extra $10,000 for their troubles. Greg Sachs was a field filler for most of his career, joining the likes of Dave Marcus, J.D. McDuffie, and Buddy Arrington in duking it out for top 30 finishes. But in 1985 at the Firecracker 400, he found himself with an older Monte Carlo SS that was bad fast. He qualified 9th and swapped the lead with Bill Elliott a few times before pulling away and straight up outrunning the fastest guy in the sport. It was his first and only win in the top division. Probably the most famous example of a field filler thwomping the field was at the 2006 Kentucky race in the Busch Series. David Gilliland started a part-time car in that race that had failed to qualify for 2 events earlier in the year and was only making its 5th start ever. They had failed to finish twice and had a best finish of 29th, but they qualified 4th and they kept working on the car all night long. With fewer than a dozen laps to go, Gilliland made the pass on J.J. Yaley and won the race, beating not 1, not 2, not 3, but 5 full-time Cup Series drivers who finished with him on the lead lap. That little team just nailed the setup that night and quietly closed down at season's end. In 2019, Spire Motorsports formed when they bought the assets of another field filler team, Premium Motorsports. Sporting the lucky number 77, they tapped young rookie Justin Haley to field the car at Daytona, since he had a pretty good track record at the superspeedways. But when rain threatened the 400-mile summer Daytona race, he stayed out along with Kurt Busch for as long as they could following an accident. When 1 to go was displayed before the race resumed, Kurt dipped into the pits to fuel up and rejoin the field at the tail end of the line. But then lightning struck. Literally. A lightning delay was called, and that's all it took before the rain moved in finally, and the race was declared for probably one of the youngest drivers to ever win in all 3 top divisions of NASCAR. At that same race in 2022, the top 10 was littered with field fillers who played it safe, waited out the storm, and walked away with top 10s. BJ McLeod has back-to-back top 10s in that race and looks to go for 3 in a row this year, as he's been field filling in every division of stock car racing since the early 2000s. And with the new next-gen cars being more or less spec cars that are all identical, this opens up the doors for field fillers to potentially chase down more wins than ever. Speed Weeks is coming up, so you should keep an eye out for these field fillers when the qualifying races come around on Thursday before the 500. With such a stacked field trying to make the 40-car grid, they'll more than likely be the best show all week. People will poke fun at and complain about back markers, but there's no denying that auto racing needs them. If it wasn't for them, the qualifying races would just be procedural nonsense not worth talking about, and battles for the lead wouldn't be nearly as exciting. These guys love to race even if they never get a shot at glory, and they put in just as much hard work, blood, sweat, and tears as anybody else, if not more so. You can vetch about them all you want, but there's no denying that racing just wouldn't be the same without them. Anyway, I'm Slapshoes, thanks for watching, and until next time, y'all take it easy.